In August of 2014, a 23-year-old woman walked through a medical center in rural South Africa searching for something important. As she moved through the little medical center, she passed offices and rooms filled with beds. She saw sick patients getting shots and young women lined up for pregnancy care. It was loud and hectic, but this was her third summer as a medical volunteer in Africa, and she knew what to expect. But some days were harder than others, and today was one of those hard days. She felt exhausted as she dragged herself to the supply room and opened the refrigerator. She pushed aside boxes of pharmacy samples to find the plastic pouch of liquid she'd been looking for. Then she hustled back down the hallway and into the last room on the right, shutting the door behind her. She hung the pouch on one of the metal IV poles they kept in the room and collected the plastic tube dangling from the bottom. Then she lifted up her shirt and found the matching plastic tube protruding from her abdomen. She connected the tube from the pouch to the one in her belly and twisted a blue plastic clip to release the drip. She sighed and flopped down into a folding chair, resting as her lunch slowly drained into her stomach. Because this bag of nutrients had not been for a patient, it was for her. This was how the volunteer had gotten all her food, all her nutrients, for the past several years, through a tube in her stomach. And her doctor told her that it was quite likely she'd never be able to eat again. At least not without enduring excruciating pain. In August of 2010, 19-year-old Mackenzie Hild hunched over her clipboard inside a large canvas tent in Rwanda. She had just finished her freshman year at Harvard University and was spending the summer working with HIV patients as a volunteer for a medical aid group. Mackenzie finished scribbling some patient notes onto her clipboard, then set it on a folding table alongside clipboards from other volunteers. She felt a little sad that the summer was coming to an end. While she was looking forward to going back to college, she'd never felt more fulfilled than over these past 3 months. Since childhood, she dreamed of working as a doctor in Africa. In fact, this was actually her second trip to the continent. She spent last summer working in a clinic in Uganda. She rubbed her eyes and then stretched and yawned, and as she did, she suddenly jerked in pain. There was a sharp cramp in her stomach, like someone had stabbed it with a knife. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, hoping the pressure would relieve the pain, but the cramping only got worse. It was not the first time this had happened. In fact, she'd had stomach cramps almost every day since she arrived in Rwanda a few months ago. Her stomach always started hurting shortly after she ate. It had gotten so bad that she was now skipping breakfast and eating as little as possible for lunch and dinner. The same thing had happened last summer in Uganda, too. She'd lost 15 pounds over 3 months. Luckily, once she got home, her weight went back to normal. So, despite being surrounded by doctors this summer, Mackenzie hadn't told anyone about her stomach pains. She figured they were just a side effect of her anti-malarial drugs. She'd be home in a few days, and the ache would go away, and she'd regain the weight she'd lost over the summer. So she took some deep breaths, riding out the pain until it subsided. Once she was feeling a bit better, Mackenzie stood up straight again. Then she went back to work and pushed the stomach ache out of her mind. A few days later, Mackenzie's mom, Joanne Hild, stood with her husband Wayne in the Sacramento airport, about 65 miles from their home in Nevada City, California. Joanne was giddy with excitement. She hadn't seen Mackenzie in 3 months and couldn't wait to pull her daughter in for a big bear hug. But when Mackenzie finally walked through the doors, Joanne was shocked. Her daughter had lost a lot of weight. Mackenzie had always been thin, but now she looked downright skeletal. Joanne looked to Wayne, who seemed equally worried. He mumbled that she must have lost a good 20 or 30 pounds. Joanne agreed, but she forced herself to smile as her daughter saw them and came rushing over. That night, Joanne sat in the living room with her daughter and husband, watching Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. Joanne had ordered pizza for dinner, thinking that a few hearty meals would help Mackenzie put the weight back on. But as they sat together, eating and watching TV, Joanne couldn't help but notice that Mackenzie hardly touched her food. And when she did take a bite, she winced, like it had a bad taste or something. She asked her daughter about it, and Mackenzie explained she hadn't been eating much recently because her stomach hurt so badly after meals. She smiled and promised her mom she would eat more once the anti-malarial meds wore off. But Joanne didn't think that sounded right. Losing a little weight might be a side effect of anti-malarial medication, but pain so intense that her daughter was skipping meals? That had to be something else. She told Mackenzie they were going to go to the doctor first thing in the morning. Mackenzie nodded, now looking a bit scared. Joanne hadn't meant to upset her daughter, but she wasn't willing to wait to see what happened either. The next morning, Joanne sat with Mackenzie in the waiting room at the local clinic. They'd met with the doctor briefly, and he had ordered a full battery of tests, including tests for tropical diseases, HIV, and digestive disorders like Crohn's. Now they were waiting to see what the results might be. Joanne couldn't keep her legs still. She bounced them nervously, even when Mackenzie told her to stop. Deep down, Joanne was worried that something could be seriously wrong with her daughter. Thankfully, it was not long before the doctor popped her head into the waiting room and waved Mackenzie back. Joanne followed, and they stepped into the same little examination room where they'd first met the doctor. The doctor told Mackenzie that all of her tests had come back negative. In her opinion, it seemed like Mackenzie's system was just being sensitive to the food she'd been eating over the summer, which explained the stomach pain and the weight loss. Her stomach should settle down in the coming weeks, and then she could regain the weight, and so the doctor just advised some rest at home. Joanne felt incredibly relieved as she promised the doctor that she would heed the advice, she would get her daughter some rest and some good home-cooked meals. And Mackenzie nodded as well, agreeing to take it easy until school started later in the month. And with that, Joanne decided to put her worries aside and focus on enjoying some quality time with her daughter before she returned to college in Boston. A few weeks later, Mackenzie sat at a large table in a wood-paneled dining hall, having dinner with some friends. She was back at Harvard, enjoying the beginning of her sophomore year. But she was still dangerously underweight, and her stomach ached every time she took so much as a small bite of food. Determined to eat anyways, she shoved a little bit of pasta into her mouth, and she chewed it until it basically dissolved inside of her mouth, and then she swallowed. Then she braced herself. Sure enough, a few minutes later, that stabbing pain erupted in her stomach. A friend noticed Mackenzie go silent and asked if everything was okay. Mackenzie just nodded and said the pain would subside in a few minutes. But 10 minutes later, the pain was only getting worse. Breathless, Mackenzie asked her friend to walk her back to her dorm room. She wanted to go lie down. The friend agreed, and they made their way across the quad from the dining hall to her dorm room. Once there, Mackenzie crawled into her bed and just lay in a fetal position, waiting for the stabbing sensation to go away. But it didn't. She was in too much pain to move, and so she stayed in bed for hours, just watching reruns of Friends and holding her stomach. The pain would finally ease up, at which point she was able to sit upright. Mackenzie went to the bathroom to brush her teeth, then tried to get some sleep. 2 weeks later, Mackenzie was in the emergency room, holding her stomach in agony. After 2 weeks of near constant stabbing pain, Mackenzie had finally gone to the student health center on campus. But she had been so underweight when she arrived that the staff didn't think they'd be able to treat her. Instead, they called an ambulance to take her to the hospital where she was now. A doctor walked into the room and pulled up a stool so that she was sitting directly across from Mackenzie. And then she leaned in, looking as though she had some bad news. The doctor explained that Mackenzie weighed only 75 pounds, which was a life-threatening weight for someone who was 5 feet 3 inches tall. The doctor said it was a good thing that Mackenzie had gone to the student health clinic for help. She might not have made it much longer on her own. The thought was terrifying. Mackenzie could feel her heart start to race as the doctor ordered a full workup of tests and then promised they would get to the bottom of her pain. Mackenzie called her parents to let them know what was going on, and her mom said she'd book the next flight out of Sacramento. Mackenzie wanted to tell her mom that she was overreacting, that everything would be fine, but for the first time since she got sick, she didn't know if that was even true. This thought made her eyes sting with tears, and she begged her mom to please hurry up. When the doctor returned a few hours later, she wasn't alone. There was a small medical team with her, who told Mackenzie they had her test results. Mackenzie braced herself, hoping for something definitive. Instead, the doctors explained that all of Mackenzie's tests had come back normal. Mackenzie was shocked. She certainly did not feel normal, but then the doctor went on. Because her tests were normal, it was likely her weight loss was due to a psychological issue, not a physical one. So instead of surgery or medication, they wanted to send her to an inpatient treatment center, specifically one that specialized in eating disorders. Mackenzie blinked. Sure, she had just heard the doctor wrong. She didn't have an eating disorder. In fact, she was desperately trying to eat. But the doctor just shook her head and said that while that might seem true, Mackenzie's extreme weight loss and the fact that she sometimes skipped meals altogether pointed to a diagnosis of anorexia. Mackenzie tried to keep herself together to convince them that she only skipped meals because of the physical pain in her stomach, but the doctors were certain that she was just struggling with an eating disorder. An hour later, Mackenzie felt so relieved when her mother walked into her hospital room. She began crying and then started trying to explain what the doctors had said to her, because she knew her mother would believe her. She would set the doctors straight. Instead, her mom sat on the edge of the bed and told Mackenzie that the inpatient center was probably best. They had to trust the doctors. They knew what they were doing. Mackenzie felt overwhelmed as she realized what her mother was saying, that she would be going to the treatment facility in a matter of hours to have her mental health examined. A month later, Mackenzie sat at a metal lunch table with a nurse sitting nearby. Mackenzie forced herself to eat the food in front of her, even though every bite felt like molten iron hitting her stomach. She'd spent the past 4 weeks in a medical unit for people with eating disorders and had been observed at mealtimes like this one on a regular basis. She choked down as much food as she could handle, knowing that she was not going to be released until she gained back some of the weight she'd lost over the summer. Her stomach now hurt all the time, and not just when she was eating. It now hurt to walk, to sleep, to move, just to think it hurt. And the worst part was that everybody kept telling her it was all in her head. She felt unhinged and angry. Angry that her doctors didn't believe her. Angry that she was missing school to be in this medical unit. And angry that she was in too much pain to eat. She felt like she was going crazy. She finished the last bite of her oatmeal and dropped her spoon in triumph. The nurse told her she had done a great job, then followed her to the small office where Mackenzie weighed in every few days. She stepped on a digital scale, and the nurse took down her weight from a screen that Mackenzie couldn't see. Blind weigh-ins were clinic policy because they didn't want the patients thinking about how much they weighed. But Mackenzie wanted to know. She was praying that she'd managed to put more weight on. Her clothes had been fitting her better, which she hoped was a good sign. Mackenzie sighed with relief when the nurse looked at her weight on the screen and then told her that she should be proud of her efforts. Mackenzie's stomach was already aching from the oatmeal she'd just eaten, but she refused to show it. She would do anything to leave this place and return to school. And if that meant she had to bear down and hide the agony she suffered every time she swallowed food, well, that was fine. 5 months later, in the spring of 2011, Mackenzie sat upright in a bed at a medical facility while a nurse took her vitals. Mackenzie's parents waited anxiously by her side. Thankfully, Mackenzie's weight had stabilized, which allowed her to move back home with her parents back in Nevada City. But eating was still extremely painful, and Mackenzie knew that if she didn't do something to fix it, her weight could plummet right back down again. So now, a doctor was about to insert a permanent feeding tube through Mackenzie's nose and down her throat. It was a radical idea, but Mackenzie's gastroenterologist thought it might help her maintain her weight. Nutrients would now bypass her hypersensitive stomach altogether and instead go directly to her small intestine. From now on, Mackenzie would have to navigate the world with a tube in her nose. But the doctor thought it might help her gut rest for a while and alleviate the pain, which could allow Mackenzie to go back to school. And to Mackenzie, that was worth the risk. The nurse finished taking her vitals, and a few minutes later, the doctor came in and got all the equipment ready. Mackenzie smiled at her parents as the doctor inserted the tube up her nose, down her esophagus, and into her small intestine. Her mom asked her how she was feeling. Mackenzie had to be honest. Not great. But at least she wasn't having stabbing pains in her stomach. And hopefully, it would all be upwards from here. A few weeks later, Mackenzie arrived at her gastroenterologist's office for a routine checkup. She stepped on the scale, which flashed 105 pounds. It was phenomenal news. She'd officially regained all the weight she'd lost since first going to Rwanda. Mackenzie was overjoyed. And then it got even better when her gastroenterologist told her he was officially ruling out anorexia as a diagnosis, and he was approving Mackenzie to return to college in the fall. Now, the gastroenterologist was clear. They still didn't know what was causing Mackenzie so much pain, but at the very least, it didn't have to stop her from living her life. Mackenzie was too excited to care at that moment. She could not wait to get home and re-enroll at Harvard. In early September of 2011, Mackenzie sat in a dining hall with her friends for the first time in a year. She couldn't have been happier to be back on campus, even if it meant that she was now a year behind her classmates. Mackenzie was getting all of her food through the nasal feeding tube now, and while that normally didn't bother her, it was Taco Tuesday at the dining hall, and her stomach almost grumbled as she smelled the chili peppers and grilled onions. She didn't miss the stomach pain, but some days she really missed eating. And she also didn't like the feeling that everybody was always looking at her. She was the nose tube girl, and she felt even more conspicuous when she was sitting next to friends at the dining hall. So she took out a textbook, deciding to get a jump start on her homework while her friends ate. Their mouths were too full to talk anyway. Mackenzie had a full course load this semester, and she'd volunteered to work at a local homeless shelter. So really, she told herself, cutting out the time it took to actually eat meals was for the best. Just then, one of her friends asked her if she wanted to try just a little bit of the churros they were serving for dessert, and Mackenzie did. She really did. But she still shook her head no. She told her friend that she was enjoying her life and that really this was no big deal. But the friend frowned, not quite believing her, and then went back to eating. As for Mackenzie, she sighed and went back to her homework. The following summer, in July of 2012, Mackenzie stood in line at a burger shack outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was spending the summer volunteering again, this time on Native American reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. She was thrilled to be back in the field, and best of all, she no longer had a feeding tube coming out of her nose. She stepped up to the counter and handed the cashier a list of orders. She apologized for the large volume. The food was for a clinic full of hungry doctors waiting on burgers and chicken sandwiches. But none of this food was for Mackenzie. Even though she no longer had a nasal feeding tube, she still wasn't eating. That May, surgeons had given her a stomach feeding tube that was less conspicuous than the one in her nose. They'd also removed her gallbladder to avoid the risk of gallstones, hoping that would relieve her pain somewhat. But her new feeding tube delivered nutrition to her stomach, and so she was getting those stabbing stomach pains again, even now as she stood outside the burger shack. They weren't as bad or as prolonged as when she actually ate food, but still, it hurt. Mackenzie stood around the parking lot, waiting for her order to be up and checking her watch. She was waiting for a phone consultation with her gastroenterologist, who she still checked in with routinely. And today, she had a special request. She wanted to know when she could go back to volunteering in Africa. She'd gotten used to not eating, but she was tired of letting her stomach pain rule her life. She wanted clearance to go back overseas. Just then, Mackenzie picked up the burgers, and a few minutes later, her doctor called. Mackenzie updated him on how she was doing, and then she asked for clearance to go back to work in Africa. The doctor paused for a moment to think, and then finally he said yes. He thought it would be okay for her to go. Mackenzie was so happy. She thanked the doctor, hung up, and jumped in her car. As soon as she had a free moment, she would start making plans. Two years later, in the summer of 2014, Mackenzie's mom, Joanne, was on a hike with her husband, Wayne. It was a dry, hot day in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, and Joanne could see Wayne, who was a little ahead of her on the trail, pouring some of their water over his head to cool off. Joanne was lagging behind him because she was in deep conversation with a fellow hiker. She was telling her new friend about her daughter, and he was nodding his head as Joanne described Mackenzie's struggle to live a full life despite her illness. Because this fellow hiker, whom she just met, happened to be a doctor at the University of California at San Francisco who specialized in advocating for patients with complex medical cases. Joanne explained that Mackenzie was currently in South Africa, volunteering after she graduated from Harvard in May. Her doctors had been reluctant to let her go, but said if she really felt called to return to Africa, well, South Africa would be okay. The doctor that Joanne was talking to on the trail raised his eyebrows and admitted that he was impressed. Mackenzie sounded like a really special person. He asked if he and a medical student could contact Mackenzie. He was currently teaching a course on medical advocacy, and Mackenzie's case sounded like an ideal mystery to investigate. Joanne couldn't hide her excitement. For the first time in 5 years, it felt like maybe, just maybe, they would get some real answers here. The moment Joanne and Wayne got back to their car, Joanne texted her daughter in South Africa, telling her all about the chance encounter with this doctor. A few weeks later, a medical student named Jessica Gould sat next to the professor Joanne had met on the hiking trail. They were about to join a Skype call with Mackenzie. Jessica had been helping her professor look over Mackenzie's case and devise questions and theories that might guide their Skype call, and so she felt prepared for this, but in all honesty, Jessica was nervous. She had read how many specialists had worked with Mackenzie, and she didn't know what she, a fourth-year medical student, could offer. There was a ding on the computer, and Mackenzie appeared on the screen. She was thin, almost frail, and looked impossibly tired. And not from a bad night of sleep, but from years of exhaustion. Despite that, she was smiling and waving, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun on the top of her head. Jessica admired Mackenzie's determination. She hoped there was some way they could help her. She and her professor said hello, and the more they spoke with Mackenzie, the more inspired Jessica became by her. She thought about how Mackenzie approached her chronic illness. Despite her constant pain, Mackenzie still found ways to help others thousands of miles from home. And so if Mackenzie could find ways to help others, well, Jessica could find a way to help Mackenzie. Several months later, Jessica was sitting in front of her laptop, as always, feeling exhausted. She was on a phone call with her professor, explaining that she still hadn't figured out what was wrong with Mackenzie. She was frustrated. She'd spent nearly every minute of her free time chasing down leads, devouring thousands of pages of records from different hospitals, and searching through medical databases, anything that could help her find a way to help Mackenzie Hild. But every lead she chased met a dead end. It was maddening, and she told her professor as much. He just sighed and was silent for a long moment. Then, he suggested Jessica go back and look at the more common diseases that all of Mackenzie's specialists had ruled out. Maybe Jessica's fresh perspective would unearth some clue these specialists had missed. Jessica doubted that she would find something that the country's top doctors had overlooked, but she didn't have any other leads to pursue, so she agreed. A few weeks later, in January 2015, Mackenzie was lounging on the couch back home in Nevada City when her phone rang. When she answered, the man who spoke to her was Dr. Christopher Skelly, the chief of vascular surgery at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Dr. Skelly explained that before the holidays, he'd received an interesting email from a medical student named Jessica Gould. And after chatting with Jessica, he had agreed to review Mackenzie's case. And in his opinion, he knew what was causing Mackenzie's pain and had a way to treat it. Mackenzie's heart pounded. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. For the past 6 years, she'd either been living in excruciating pain or with a feeding tube up her nose or in her stomach. It had been 5 years since she last chewed food or even tasted it. She thought this was how she would live the rest of her life. She'd grieved, she'd processed, she'd found a way to move on. And now she was hearing that there might be a cure. She told Dr. Skelly that she couldn't book her ticket to Chicago quickly enough. 4 weeks later, Mackenzie arrived at Dr. Skelly's office feeling nervous and thrilled. After some testing, Dr. Skelly told Mackenzie that he believed her symptoms were physical, not psychological. In fact, he believed she had been suffering for years because of a physical abnormality that she'd had since birth. And the tests proved it. Just hearing those words flooded Mackenzie with relief. She wanted to cry. Then Dr. Skelly finally gave her an official diagnosis. He said that Mackenzie had a rare and little-known condition called median arcuate ligament syndrome, or MALS for short. He explained that the median arcuate ligament is a band of tissue that runs from the base of the diaphragm, the muscles that help us breathe, up to the heart. For people with MALS, that band of tissue is in the wrong place. It crosses over the heart and compresses the artery that supplies blood to the stomach and other organs. This impaired blood flow can cause intense pain when eating because the stomach isn't getting the blood supply it needs to digest the food. Doctors had actually tested Mackenzie for MALS early on, but those results came back negative. However, when Jessica went back and reviewed the early decisions in Mackenzie's case, she thought MALS perfectly explained Mackenzie's symptoms. And so Jessica had convinced a leading expert on MALS, Dr. Skelly, to investigate whether her hunch was right. And when he did, Dr. Skelly determined that the previous tests were wrong. Mackenzie did have MALS after all. On March 18, 2015, Dr. Skelly performed a 2.5-hour surgery on Mackenzie to relieve the pressure on the arteries supplying blood to her stomach. The next day, when Mackenzie woke up, she had her first bite of food in 5 years, a spoonful of scrambled eggs from the hospital cafeteria. She chewed, she swallowed, and then she waited, and no pain came. and she burst into tears of joy. It would take a few weeks for her stomach to get used to eating, but the pain never did come back. After recovering from Mall syndrome, Mackenzie went on to attend medical school at the University of Washington in Seattle. Tennessee, a mother jolted awake to the sound of footsteps running down the hallway outside of her bedroom, followed by the sound of a door slamming. And so the mother rubbed her eyes and jumped out of bed, and as she hurried down the hallway, she heard her teenage daughter in the bathroom groaning and vomiting. And so she pushed open the door and found her daughter on her knees, still in her pajamas, clutching the toilet. The mother crouched down by her daughter and held back her hair as she threw up again and again. And then finally, the daughter stopped retching and just collapsed on the floor and started crying. And in between sobs, she told her mother that her whole mouth was on fire. It was just burning with pain. And so instinctively, the mother grabbed a cup and filled it with cold water and gave it to her daughter to sip on. But as the girl tilted back the cup, the mother saw inside of her daughter's mouth, and she nearly gagged. Her daughter's entire mouth was covered in these reddish, pus-covered sores. A couple weeks before Thanksgiving in 2015, a woman named Cicely Odom Rose made her way along the buffet line of a holiday potluck party, loading up her plate with a little bit of everything. Once it was full, she carried it across the room to her 15-year-old daughter, Kennedy. Cicely and her daughter were best friends, and they bonded over their shared loves, like parties, their tight-knit family in Memphis, and of course, great home-cooked food. But when Cicely handed the plate of food to her daughter, Kennedy sort of waved the plate away, pointing at her jaw. Kennedy had just gotten her braces tightened the day before, and apparently they still hurt too much for her to chew. It would turn out both Kennedy and her mother, Cicely, had both gotten braces on their teeth at the same time, back in February. But their dental journeys since then had been very different. Cicely didn't really mind or even notice the braces very much, but Kennedy found hers totally aggravating, and every time hers were tightened, she'd be in pain for days. Cicely handed Kennedy's plate of food to a family friend, and then took a seat next to her daughter. Cicely could see on Kennedy's face how disappointed she was. This annual family party was something she looked forward to every year. And so Cicely gave Kennedy a big hug and promised her she would feel better soon. Early the next morning, Cicely awoke to Kennedy knocking on her bedroom door. And when her daughter opened the door, she looked exhausted, and she told Cicely that she actually had barely slept all night because her head was throbbing so badly. Cicely grabbed a bottle of aspirin from her bedside table, shook a few pills into her hand, and gave them to Kennedy. Cicely told her daughter to take the pills and go back to bed. A little pain relief and rest could cure anything. But a couple of hours later, when Cicely poked her head into her daughter's room, she found Kennedy curled on her side with a pillow over her head, and she would tell her mother that the pills hadn't helped and her headache was still pounding. Cicely walked over to her daughter and placed the back of her hand against Kennedy's forehead to see if she was burning up. And she did feel slightly warm, but Cicely was now suddenly more worried about Kennedy's lips. They looked swollen and inflamed. She wondered if Kennedy might have caught some sort of bug or rash at the party. Cicely got an ice pack from the freezer, wrapped it in a towel, and had Kennedy hold it to her lips to try to reduce the swelling. Then she brought Kennedy some more aspirin and also fluffed up her pillows. But as she stood to leave, Cicely's heart broke to see her daughter in so much obvious discomfort. And so she made a mental note to plan something fun for Kennedy as soon as she was better. But the next morning, Kennedy had not improved at all. Cicely found her curled up in a fetal position under the covers, looking even weaker and more haggard after another bad night's sleep. Kennedy told her mother that in addition to all these symptoms she was feeling, that at some point in the previous night, her throat had also started to hurt, and now there was a stabbing pain every time she swallowed. And so at this point, Cicely decided enough was enough. She helped Kennedy get dressed and then guided her out to the car and drove her to the nearest clinic. After being shown to an exam room, a nurse gave Kennedy a checkup and swabbed her throat to run some tests. And while they waited, Cicely held her daughter close to her chest and rocked her back and forth, just like she had when she was a little girl. Cicely couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her daughter this sick. I mean, her daughter looked hollowed out and wrecked. Cicely could tell that, whatever this was, it couldn't be normal. Finally, there was a knock at the door, and Kennedy's doctor came inside, and he told them he had good and bad news. The bad news was that Kennedy had caught a bacterial infection called strep throat, which is very painful. It's like the worst sore throat you can get. But the good news was that if Kennedy took a few days of antibiotics, she would bounce right back. And so the doctor scribbled out a prescription, handed it to Cicely, and then told Kennedy she would feel better soon. But just a few days later, Cicely's car came to a stop in front of a hospital, and then she and her daughter went inside of the ER. Cicely told the doctor on duty about Kennedy's strep throat diagnosis and how she had been taking antibiotics for a few days without any signs of improvement. Then suddenly this morning, things went south. Kennedy woke up vomiting from pain, and sores had broken out all over the inside of her mouth. The doctor nodded and asked Kennedy to open up her mouth. And after she had, the doctor used a tongue depressor and flashlight and began examining the walls of her mouth and all around her tongue. Kennedy whimpered at the touch, and then eventually, at the end of the examination, the doctor swabbed one of Kennedy's sores and handed the sample to a nurse who took it to the lab. And then the doctor walked out of the exam room, leaving the mother and daughter alone. As Cicely stood behind Kennedy, stroking her hair, she wondered if the sores in her daughter's mouth might be some sort of complication from the antibiotics. Kennedy had never been allergic to medication as a child, but she knew that sometimes allergies don't develop until later in life. Either way, Cicely felt confident that the hospital would figure out what was going on with her daughter, and they would get her started on the right treatment. Eventually, the doctor returned, and he told Cicely that Kennedy was still testing positive for strep throat. However, her strep infection had nothing to do with the sores. He said that, most likely the sores were being caused by some sort of virus, but he wouldn't know for sure until they ran more tests. In the meantime, the doctor told Cicely that he wanted to rule out more serious possibilities, namely Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a rare but sometimes deadly skin disease. At hearing this, Cicely felt blindsided. She didn't understand how an ordinary case of strep throat could have anything to do with this potentially fatal condition the doctor was talking about. Cicely tried to keep her composure for her daughter's sake, but it was hard to act calm with news like this. Once the doctor left the room again, Cicely whipped out her phone and called Kennedy's godmother, Tamara. Tamara had always been a rock for Cicely's family. She was one of those people who just always seemed to know what to do in stressful situations. And so Cicely gripped her daughter's hand tightly as she explained to Tamara everything that had happened over the past few days. She told Tamara that she and Kennedy really needed her help, because Kennedy's journey to recovery was starting to look like a rocky road. 3 months later, Cicely sat in another hospital room, watching a doctor examine Kennedy's abdomen. She barely recognized her daughter's body anymore. Kennedy looked skeletal and frail, having lost more than 30 pounds in the past few months, and none of the doctors they had visited so far could figure out why. Now, Kennedy had stopped testing positive for the strep bacteria, but her other symptoms, like sore throat, swollen lips, fevers, and various mysterious aches, those hadn't gone away. But worst of all the symptoms were the sores in Kennedy's mouth. They had only grown more painful and more sensitive until Kennedy finally just stopped being able to eat. Cicely had even asked Tamara to make her famous homemade chicken soup, which had always been Kennedy's favorite food, but the sores still hurt too much for her to even finish a small cup of it. And so day after day, Cicely watched her daughter get thinner and weaker until finally it got so bad that Kennedy had to stop going to school. She just didn't have the strength to make it through the day without going to bed. But not seeing her friends really only deepened Kennedy's depression. Cicely took Kennedy to every doctor and every specialist around Memphis, but they were all mystified by what could be causing her symptoms. And so today's appointment was for an ultrasound to try to get a clearer picture of Kennedy's organs. As the doctor moved the ultrasound wand along Kennedy's body, searching for anything unusual, Kennedy suddenly cried out in pain. She told the doctor that the area he had just touched felt like a knife was going into her side. The doctor quickly wheeled the ultrasound machine closer to Kennedy's bedside and then turned the screen so Cicely could see what he was seeing. Cicely couldn't quite tell what she was looking at on the screen, since the image was grainy and pixelated, but the doctor kept his eyes glued to one spot as he carefully moved the wand up and down on Kennedy's body. Eventually, the doctor set the wand down, wiped the gel off of Kennedy's belly from the ultrasound machine, and pulled off his gloves. He told Cicely that what he'd just seen on the ultrasound was very worrisome. Kennedy's spleen looked very enlarged. Since the spleen is what filters blood and fights off infections, when it's not functioning properly, then the whole body is extremely vulnerable. Not only that, but most causes of an enlarged spleen are serious, from infections to anemia, and even to certain cancers like leukemia, which affects the blood and bones. The doctor apologized for not having better news, but it looked likely that Kennedy was up against something pretty severe. Cicely didn't even know how to react. She looked over at her poor daughter, who looked so small and defenseless lying on the bed, and she just couldn't understand why all these horrible things were happening to such a sweet and innocent girl. And so once the doctor left, Cicely pulled out her phone and hatched a new plan. It was time to stop waiting for a miracle. Days later, Kennedy's godmother, Tamara, knocked on the door of the Odom family home. Tamara took her role as godmother very seriously, and she, like Cicely, had been worried sick throughout Kennedy's ordeal. Tonight, Cicely had invited her over to discuss the whole situation and try to do some research. When Cicely opened the door, Tamara pulled her in for a big hug. She could see the stress all over Cicely's face. Tamara couldn't even imagine what it would be like to have one of her own children go through something this harrowing and sort of being helpless to stop it. Once inside the house, Tamara went ahead and poured 2 big glasses of wine and then followed Cicely to her computer. The women took turns searching medical forums for descriptions of cases that were similar to Kennedy's, but they didn't find anything that matched. And so eventually, Tamara asked Cicely to walk her through every detail of Kennedy's recent doctor's appointments while she made notes of everything. Tamara had a feeling that there had to be some clue staring them right in the face about what was going on with Kennedy. She just didn't know what it was yet. And so, before leaving, Tamara just told Cicely that she wanted to go wish Kennedy goodnight. And so she walked down the hall, knocked softly on Kennedy's door, and then went in and took a seat on the edge of her goddaughter's bed. And when she looked down at Kennedy, she was disturbed at how thin she looked. The girl used to be such a vibrant teenager, but now she was like a shell of herself. And then Tamara told Kennedy that as soon as her appetite came back, she would cook her a whole buffet of her favorite foods to try to put some meat back on her bones. Now, Tamara didn't say that to be a joke, but Kennedy sort of laughed and cracked a smile when she said it. But as Kennedy did, with her mouth wide open in full view of Tamara, suddenly a light bulb went off in Tamara's head. She didn't know how she would prove this, but she thought if she was right about her theory about Kennedy, it would explain everything. Tamara kissed Kennedy on the forehead and tucked her back in, and then slipped out the door to go share her new theory with Cicely. Now, Cicely was skeptical. To her, the idea was too obvious to be true. She found it impossible to believe that all of Kennedy's doctors would have overlooked something so simple. Tamara agreed with Cicely that it could be a long shot, but given all that Kennedy had gone through already, they owed it to her to follow every lead. And so Cicely nodded, thanked her friend, and told Tamara she'd do some more research. Weeks later, Cicely got a call from the hospital. They told her that a specialist had been assigned to Kennedy's case, a Dr. Mitchell Godat. When Dr. Godat had heard about Tamara's new theory that she had learned after looking at her goddaughter's mouth, it gave him an idea. He thought Kennedy's enlarged spleen indicated an allergic reaction, so he asked Cicely to bring Kennedy back to the hospital so they could test different allergens on her skin. And that hospital visit would accomplish what none of the others had been able to do, isolating the cause of Kennedy's symptoms. And the cause had been staring them all in the face since day one. When the doctors told Cicely, she was speechless. Once again, Tamara had been right. That night in Kennedy's bedroom, when Kennedy had sort of laughed at Tamara talking about putting meat in her bones, well, Tamara had looked down and noticed the girl's braces were reflecting in the light of the bedside lamp, which made her wonder, what if Kennedy's braces were the issue? And so Tamara had suggested this to Cicely, and then after Tamara went home that night, Cicely thought back and realized that all of Kennedy's health problems began after her daughter's braces were put in. And she also remembered that every time Kennedy had her braces tightened, she would complain of intense pain in her mouth, and the pain seemed to only get worse as time went on. Cicely had mentioned this to Kennedy's orthodontist the first time it happened, but he told her that for some kids, braces are far more uncomfortable than for others, and it really was nothing to worry about. But in fact, it was something to worry about. It turned out Kennedy was allergic to nickel, which is what her braces were made of. It was the strep infection that finally pushed things over the edge. The allergy didn't give her strep throat, but the two problems combined caused Kennedy's immune system to begin attacking her body and making her much, much sicker. That's when she started getting the headaches, the sores, and everything else. Dr. Godat told Cicely that her daughter's symptoms would have only worsened and intensified if they had not identified her nickel allergy. Left untreated, her condition could have even turned fatal. Cicely was overcome with relief. Right away, she took Kennedy to the orthodontist and got her braces removed, and within hours, Kennedy began feeling better. And soon, she would make a full recovery. One dusty summer afternoon in 2013, a man named John Lee sighed with relief as he pulled his Jeep into the driveway of his family's home in Australia. John and his family had been on a very nice weekend getaway into the outback to camp and hunt, but the whole drive back home had been an absolute horror show. His 8-year-old son Mason would not stop fidgeting and talking and fighting with his siblings, and so it made the already very long drive back home feel twice as long. The second John turned off the car, Mason flung the door open and sprinted off. John looked over at his wife, Patty, and they shared a look of absolute exhaustion. Mason had always been hyperactive, but lately his crazy energy had really ramped up. His siblings basically tolerated it, but sometimes even they seemed overwhelmed by Mason's frantic dash from one thing to the next. John got out and opened up the trunk and began unloading the car, while Patty took the kids inside. Inside the garage, John stacked the family's tents and sleeping bags in big storage tubs, and then placed his shotgun and ammunition in a standing gun rack. Finally, he carefully packed the wild geese that he'd killed into an industrial-sized freezer. He would pluck and prepare them later for future family dinners. Once everything was packed away, John went inside the house, where his wife was in the kitchen putting away food. Patty asked him if Mason was with him, but John told her that he had assumed the boy was inside with her. Patty stopped unpacking and shot John a worried look. It was never a good sign when neither of them knew what Mason was up to. John left the kitchen to go find out what sort of hyperactive mischief his son had gotten into this time. And he could hear the destruction even before he saw it. He found Mason holding a hammer, completely destroying his playhouse. And so as John stood there, shocked, surveying the wreckage, he realized this couldn't wait any longer. Mason needed professional help. Later that week, John sat next to his son in the lobby of a pediatrician's office, waiting for Mason's appointment. And as they waited, Mason wouldn't stop ripping the leaves off of potted plants, and so John just handed him a magazine to tear apart instead. When the receptionist finally called for them, John and Mason followed a nurse down a hall and into an examination room. Once Mason's pediatrician, who was named Dr. Stephen Thomas, walked into the room, John explained that Mason had been acting strangely lately. The way he played had turned aggressive. He was now breaking his siblings' toys and riding his bike right through the neighbors' gardens. And so now John said, he and his wife were overwhelmed and they were worried that there might be something medically wrong with Mason. Dr. Thomas nodded and said he would order some blood tests. Then he asked Mason to sit on the examination table while a nurse came in and drew a few vials of his blood. And so while that was happening, the doctor asked John what Mason's daily life was like. What did he eat? What did he like to do? John told him the family ate a very balanced diet, including some wild game, and Mason lived a very active outdoor life, exploring the neighborhood, swimming, and playing with friends. And until recently, John said, his son had been a very normal boy. The doctor jotted down some notes and then told them to go get some lunch and come back in the afternoon when Mason's blood work would be ready. A couple hours later, John and Mason came back to the same examination room, and not long after, Dr. Thomas entered carrying printouts of Mason's results. and he told John he had some worrying news. He said Mason's blood contained dangerously elevated levels of lead. The doctor explained that lead poisoning can have very serious consequences, especially in children. High levels of lead in the blood can cause permanent mental disabilities. It can also lead to hyperactive behavior and the very kind of violent outbursts that Mason had been having. John was speechless. He couldn't imagine where or how Mason could be coming into that much contact with a toxic heavy metal. John immediately wondered if this meant his other children were also lead poisoned. Dr. Thomas asked John if their house was older, because if it was possible there was lead in the house paint. He also asked John if they maybe had some old toys or old heirlooms in the house, because those too could have lead in them. John racked his brain picturing his son's room, but all of his son's toys and furniture were all fairly new, and then also John knew that paint used to contain high levels of lead, but their home had been built after the Australian government had cracked down on lead paint in the 1970s, and so John knew his house was safe. And so after telling the doctor this, the doctor just told John that it was extremely important that he find out where the lead was coming from and to take action to stop the exposure. And so John said he would talk it over with his wife and see what they could figure out. Early the next week, John returned home from running errands to find Patty inside of Mason's bedroom, and Mason was curled up in a ball in his bed, saying that there was a stabbing pain in his gut that wouldn't stop. Patty told John that she had given Mason tea and some fizzy water, thinking it might help settle his stomach, but neither had helped. John couldn't bear to hear his son whimper and moan like this. The boy seemed to be in far more pain than just a normal stomach ache. So John just told Patty he was going to take Mason back to the doctor. Then he scooped Mason up in his arms, wrapped him in a blanket, and carried him out to the car. At the clinic, the receptionist waved John and Mason through to see Dr. Thomas immediately. John explained that his son had suddenly developed severe stomach pains, and so the doctor immediately sent Mason to get his stomach x-rayed. 20 minutes later, Dr. Thomas pulled up the x-rays on the computer inside of Mason's exam room. John stared at the black and white picture of his son's ribcage and his spine, and towards the bottom of the x-ray, in the middle of Mason's gut, was a scattering of small white circles. But John had no idea what they were. The doctor lowered his voice and told John he couldn't identify the quarter-inch wide objects in the x-ray either, but there were a lot of them. They were definitely metallic, and they were lodged in the lower right side of Mason's abdomen. He told John that at some point Mason must have swallowed these things, and then somehow they had gotten stuck in his intestines rather than just passing through. The doctor suspected that these objects were the things causing Mason's abdominal distress. Dr. Thomas walked over to Mason's bed and pulled up a stool and sat down, and then he asked Mason if he'd eaten anything strange recently, maybe on a dare from friends. John watched as his son opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then Mason stopped. And then Mason just shook his head and told the doctor that nope, he couldn't think of anything like that. Dr. Thomas shrugged and gave Mason a gentle pat on the leg, and then he stood up and pulled John to the side of the room. He told John that the most important thing here was for these objects to be removed immediately. They could be responsible for the lead in his system, and the longer they stayed in Mason's body, the higher the risk that they would begin to poison Mason or cause a bowel obstruction. John was feeling totally overwhelmed, but he just asked the doctor, what are the next steps then? Dr. Thomas didn't hesitate. He said Mason would need a medical-grade enema to clean his digestive tract. This was guaranteed to flush out any foreign objects. Dr. Thomas had actually already referred Mason's case to another doctor, Dr. Joseph Malouf, who would supervise the procedure. Dr. Thomas promised John that it would be quick and not at all painful for Mason. He would just feel very full. John and Patty could even be there to hold their son's hand throughout the whole thing. A couple hours later, Dr. Malouf went to his computer and opened an X-ray image of Mason's body that was taken after the intestinal flush. And the second he saw it, his jaw dropped. None of those metallic objects had even moved. They were all still right there in Mason's gut, the same as before. Dr. Malouf zoomed into the image and studied the cluster of round objects. The fact that the flush hadn't worked actually got him thinking. All Mason's doctors had presumed that Mason had swallowed these little balls, and therefore they must be lodged in his digestive tract. But the boy's digestive tract was now entirely empty, So these things couldn't be in his intestines. So where were they? An idea slowly began to take shape inside of Dr. Malouf's mind. It didn't really make sense, but it was possible, and if his hunch was right, it would explain everything. However, Dr. Malouf realized that his idea was pretty risky. To find out if his idea was right, Mason would have to undergo abdominal surgery. But if they did nothing, then these metal objects could wreak havoc in Mason's body. And so Dr. Malouf weighed the risks and decided there really wasn't any more time to waste. They would go forward with the surgery. It was the best and frankly only thing they could do. Days later, a surgeon carefully made an incision into Mason's abdomen. He was glad to see that the boy's organs looked normal, with no inflammation or visible infections. Using the X-ray images as his guide, the surgeon delicately isolated a small organ from the right side of Mason's gut, Mason's appendix. And as soon as he cut the organ free and he lifted it up with his forceps, he knew this was it. The appendix was much heavier than it should have been. Setting the organ down on a tray, the surgeon slowly sliced into the tissue and struck metal. Then it happened again and again. He realized that Dr. Malouf's hunch was right. By the time the surgeon was done dissecting Mason's appendix, he had discovered 57 lead pellets. While the surgeon stitched Mason back up, Dr. Malouf took one of the pellets into the waiting room and showed it to John and Patty. John instantly recognized it. He used those small lead pellets in his shotgun to hunt wild geese, which he would then cook and feed to his family. Once Mason recovered from his surgery, Dr. Malouf asked him, why didn't you tell anyone that you were eating your father's ammunition? Mason was embarrassed, but he explained that he and his siblings played a game where they would race to see who could make the most pellets disappear the fastest. And he did it by eating handfuls of these lead pellets. And the reason Mason hadn't said anything was he was worried his father would get mad at him if he found out, so he kept it a secret. Tests revealed that Mason's siblings had also been eating shotgun pellets, and so they too had elevated levels of lead in their body. And so, just like Mason, they all also underwent a bowel flushing procedure. Yet only Mason's pellets had gotten stuck in his appendix. The other children had simply passed the shotgun pellets in their bowel movements. Dr. Malouf was mystified by how the pellets got stuck inside of Mason. Occasionally, certain foods, like the seeds of small fruit, will bypass the intestines and get lodged in the appendix, but it's highly uncommon. For something the size of a lead pellet to end up there made no sense, and for it to happen 57 times really defied all logic. Dr. Malouf never did figure it out, but fortunately, Mason still made a full recovery, and gradually his lead levels decreased back to normal. But Dr. Malouf urged John to keep a closer eye on his ammunition, and to switch to pellets not made with the poisonous metal. In 1996, a young milkmaid in southwest England was taking a quick break from her duties. She left the barn where she worked to take a stroll around the farm, and she noticed a bush covered in beautiful pink roses. The milkmaid thought how nice the flowers would look inside of her room, so she tore a blossom off its stem, and as she did, a thorn scratched the side of her hand. She gasped. The cut wasn't deep, but it stung, and it was starting to bleed. It felt like an instant punishment for ignoring her job. She shoved the flowers into the pocket of her dress, wiped the blood on her apron, and quickly went back to work. She spent the day milking the cows and cleaning up the barn, and she didn't think about the scratch again until the next morning when she woke up and felt her hand throbbing. Right where the scratch had been, there was now a big, pus-filled sore. The milkmaid's face went pale. She'd never had a sore like this, but she knew people who had, and many of them had gotten so sick that they died. The milkmaid jumped out of bed, ran to the farmer's house, and begged him to send for a doctor. On a bright afternoon in April of 1795, 37-year-old James Phipps Sr. squinted in the sun as he carefully trimmed a hedge, trying to shape an overgrown bush into a perfect sphere. James was a gardener, and he tended to the estate of one of the most prominent men in Berkeley, England, a physician named Dr. Edward Jenner, who was a leading crusader against what was then the world's most feared disease, smallpox. James did not always like his job. The days were long, the weather was often bad, and his hands were always covered in cuts and sores. But working on Dr. Jenner's estate was never dull. His boss treated an unending parade of people suffering from hundreds of small, painful sores from their tongues to their toes. These sores were how smallpox got its nickname, the speckled monster. But no matter what Dr. Jenner did to help, nearly a third of the smallpox patients died, while most of the survivors ended up with scars all over their faces. And today, Dr. Jenner was doing something particularly strange. He was deliberately exposing healthy people to the deadly disease. As James trimmed the hedge, he could look through the window into Dr. Jenner's office. The dark, wood-paneled walls were lined with cabinets full of medical supplies, and the silver-haired physician stood in the center of the room, using a mortar and pestle to grind up scabs he'd collected from other patients' smallpox sores. One by one, people went into the office and allowed Dr. Jenner to blow these scabs into their noses, sending the virus deep inside of their bodies. The doctor called this process variolation. Dr. Jenner had told James that it was better to make patients sick with a mild case of smallpox like this, rather than for them to get a much worse case naturally. After all, once a patient got smallpox, they could never get it again. James had nodded like he understood, but inside, he thought it was pretty odd for healthy people to come to the doctor to get sick. Sometimes people died from the smallpox infection that Dr. Jenner gave them. So James winced every time he saw the doctor blow through his straw, knowing that the patient would soon return covered in the ugly smallpox rash. Most alarming though, James knew that one day, his 8-year-old son, James Jr., would have to go through the same ordeal. Dr. Jenner would insist. But James hoped that day was still years away. Until then, he decided to just put the frightening thought out of his mind. He stepped back again to check the shape of the hedge. It still looked a bit like an egg, so he leaned back in and kept on trimming. A few days later, James squatted beside the flower beds that lined the front of Dr. Jenner's vast, ornate home. He dug a small hole, placed a tulip bulb inside, and buried it. He moved 6 inches down and began to dig a second hole. But then, he heard footsteps coming up the walkway. James turned to see a local cattle farmer named Joseph Merritt heading towards the porch. James was surprised to see him because Joseph had come by for Dr. Jenner's clinic just a few days ago. Joseph should have been stuck at home with smallpox right now, but instead, he looked perfectly healthy. The smallpox virus that Dr. Jenner blew into his nose must not have made him sick. James lifted up a dirty hand to wave, and Joseph nodded at him before knocking on the front door and heading inside. James went back to planting tulip bulbs, but he kept thinking about Joseph. He'd never seen a person get variolated and not get sick afterwards. James tried to mind his business and focus on his work, but he just couldn't shake his curiosity. So, as he moved further down the flower bed, he peeked through a window into Dr. Jenner's clinic. Joseph sat on a wooden exam table, and to James's horror, the doctor was blowing a straw into Joseph's nose. He was exposing Joseph to smallpox again. James kept looking through the glass, wondering how Joseph had managed to avoid catching smallpox the first time. And also James thought, how sick was Joseph going to get now that he had received a double dose? About a year later, in May 1796, Dr. Edward Jenner was enjoying a quiet morning in his sunroom, sipping an after-breakfast cup of tea, when he heard a knock at his door. A few moments later, one of his servants came into the sunroom and told him that a messenger had come from a nearby village. There was a pox outbreak at one of the villagers' farms, and they needed Dr. Jenner's help. Dr. Jenner thanked the servant and immediately went to get dressed. He put on a blue coat with gold buttons and pulled his shoulder-length silver hair into a low ponytail. Then he packed his traveling medical kit with supplies, walked outside to his stable, and got on one of his horses. Dr. Jenner was the only practicing physician within 400 square miles, so he was used to traveling long distances for his patients. Luckily, this particular village was not too far away. He rode through the countryside for about half an hour, and when he spotted the farm he was looking for, he pulled on his horse's reins and slowed to a stop. Dr. Jenner got off his horse, tied the animal to a fence post, and walked towards a small house on the farm. But before he made it to the front door, it swung open, revealing a scruffy-looking man in work clothes. The farmer beckoned Dr. Jenner inside into a small sitting room. There, Dr. Jenner saw a young woman sitting on the couch, cradling her right hand. She was very pretty, with long brown hair and light eyes, but she looked like she was on the verge of tears. Dr. Jenner sat next to her and asked for her name. With a shaky voice, she said her name was Sarah Nelms. Then, she held out her right hand and showed Dr. Jenner the big pus-filled sore between her thumb and pointed finger. She explained that the previous morning, she'd been out picking roses when a thorn scratched her hand. Then, this morning, Sarah had woken up with this huge sore right where the scratch had been. Now, she felt exhausted and feverish, and her hand was throbbing. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, and through sobs, she told the doctor that she was certain she had smallpox. Dr. Jenner nodded sympathetically and then gently took Sarah's hand. Her sore did look like a smallpox spot, but Dr. Jenner knew that Sarah did not have smallpox because the disease didn't start on people's hands. It started in their mouths, then spread across their faces and down their limbs. So he reassured the girl that she didn't have smallpox, but he did have a hunch about what was making her sick. Dr. Jenner turned to the farmer and asked him to point out the barn where Sarah worked. He needed to see it for himself. Moments later, the farmer led Dr. Jenner into a wooden barn where about 30 dairy cows were eating and resting. A few of the animals turned to look at the men, and Dr. Jenner approached one of them and leaned down to look at its udder. And he saw exactly what he was expecting. The cow's udder was covered in a bumpy, scabby rash. It had dozens of sores, just like the one on Sarah's hand. Dr. Jenner walked around the barn and found that every single cow had a similar rash. Dr. Jenner was not a veterinarian, but he knew that this disease was a relative of smallpox called cowpox, and it could be spread from livestock to humans. Dr. Jenner and the farmer went back into the house where Sarah was waiting, and the doctor told her that he had good and bad news. The bad news was that she had cowpox. This meant she was going to have to quarantine herself so she wouldn't spread it to anyone else, and the sore in her hand was likely going to get worse before it got better. But the good news was that cowpox was far less deadly than smallpox, so even though it would take a few weeks for her hand to heal, Sarah was very likely going to be okay. Sarah let out a small laugh of relief and let Dr. Jenner clean and dress her wound. When he was finished, the doctor shook the farmer's hand, went back out to his horse, and began his journey home. But as he rode through the countryside, an idea began to form inside of Dr. Jenner's mind, a really exciting idea. He thought about Sarah's case of cowpox that she undoubtedly got from working with those poor sick animals. It occurred to him that he had treated many milkmaids on many different farms for cowpox. However, he couldn't actually think of a single milkmaid who ever got sick with smallpox. And that reminded him of Joseph, the cattle farmer from a year ago, the one who did not get sick after his smallpox variolation. Just like Sarah, Joseph worked with cows every day, and Dr. Jenner just could not make Joseph sick with smallpox, no matter how hard he tried. This raised a question for Dr. Jenner, one that he needed to answer right away. He pressed his right leg into his horse's side, and the animal sped up from a trot to a gallop to an all-out run. Dr. Jenner held on tight, anxious to get back home. Sitting in his office chair that same afternoon, the doctor rifled through a cabinet full of local medical records. He found the file for Joseph Merritt, the cattle farmer he'd tried to variolate last year, and in Joseph's medical history, Dr. Jenner found the answer to his burning question. Way back in 1770, so 26 years earlier, Joseph had been treated for cowpox. Then, 2.5 decades later, Dr. Jenner tried to variolate him against smallpox twice, and it didn't work. It was like Joseph was already immune to smallpox, even though he'd never had it before. So Dr. Jenner wondered, what if Joseph's previous cowpox infection was what had made him immune to smallpox? And what if the doctor could use this information to help other people? Dr. Jenner might be able to deliberately expose people to cowpox, a painful but ultimately non-fatal disease, to make them immune to smallpox, a far more dangerous illness. The doctor's mind spun a mile a minute. If this idea worked, physicians could save patients from smallpox without accidentally killing them. They could stop the world's deadliest disease in its tracks. But Dr. Jenner knew he was getting ahead of himself. First, he had to prove that his cowpox theory was right, and the only way to do that would be to experiment on a patient who had never had cowpox or smallpox. And because pretty much every adult that Dr. Jenner treated had suffered from one pox or the other already, he was going to have to experiment on a child. On May 14, 1796, James Phipps Sr. held his son's hand as they walked towards Dr. Jenner's estate. They passed the hedges James had trimmed and the tulips he'd planted, but James was not thinking about his work. He was thinking about the fact that his son was about to become a human science experiment. A few days earlier, Dr. Jenner had asked James if he'd be willing to let him test his theory on Junior. The doctor believed cowpox made people immune to smallpox, so he wanted to infect Junior with cowpox, then try to infect him with smallpox. If Junior didn't get sick, it would prove the doctor's theory was correct. But if Junior did contract smallpox, it would prove Dr. Jenner wrong, and the little boy would face a 30% chance of death. At first, James said no way. Dr. Jenner's theory was mostly based on the fact that one cattle farmer, Joseph Merritt, couldn't catch smallpox. That wasn't exactly foolproof evidence. Plus, Joseph was an adult, Junior was a child, and children were almost always more susceptible to disease. James knew if he agreed, he was going to be putting his son in mortal danger. But still, James also knew that Dr. Jenner was one of the best physicians in the country, and he did trust him. But also, there was just the harsh reality that at this time, a lot of people were getting smallpox, and when they got it, a lot of them died. And so maybe putting his son in danger now was ultimately saving his life. So James ultimately agreed to the plan. He led his son up to the front door, knocked, and a moment later, a servant showed them to the doctor's office. Inside, James saw Dr. Jenner sitting next to a young brunette woman with a bandaged right hand. Dr. Jenner stood up to say hello, then leaned down and told Junior that the woman's name was Sarah and she was going to be helping with the procedure. She had actually come out of her quarantine just for this. Junior glanced at his father nervously, and James gave him an encouraging nod. While Junior sat on the exam table, Dr. Jenner unwrapped Sarah's bandage, revealing the cowpox sore underneath. Then, the doctor grabbed a scalpel from one of the cabinets and asked Junior to hold out his arm and stay still. Dr. Jenner held Junior's wrist while he brought the scalpel towards the outside of the boy's upper arm. James put a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, and Junior drew in a sharp breath as the doctor pressed the scalpel down and dragged it about an inch across his skin. Dr. Jenner made one more cut beneath the first one, then did the same thing on Junior's other arm. Then, Dr. Jenner turned to Sarah and used the same scalpel to poke a hole in the top of her cowpox sore. Yellow pus began to leak out the top, and right away, Dr. Jenner got a small spatula to gather some of it up. Junior squirmed, but James tightened his grip on his son's shoulders to keep him still as the doctor wiped the pus directly into the cuts on both of Junior's arms. Junior looked completely grossed out, and James did too, but James was also glad that at least this part of the experiment was over. He let go of his son's shoulders, and they headed back home. Nine days later, James felt like he'd made the worst decision of his life. His son had been stuck in bed for over a week with chills, body aches, and nausea. And James knew the worst was yet to come. Even if his son recovered from cowpox, which was feeling like a big if, he still had to be exposed to smallpox. Late that evening, James brought a spoonful of stew to Junior's lips, but his son refused to eat. He was too nauseous. A voice in the back of James's mind told him that he had put his son through all this suffering for nothing. But he shook off that nagging thought, then grabbed an extra blanket to keep his boy warm. Then he told his son to call for him if he needed anything at all. Then, James blew out the candle on Junior's bedside table, went to his own room, and got into bed. And he laid there, awake, worrying about his son, until eventually he drifted off to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, James jumped out of bed and immediately went to check on his son. And to his surprise, his son was awake and smiling. Junior said he was finally starting to feel better. In fact, he was even hungry for breakfast. James was so relieved, but he did know the biggest danger was still to come. A little over a month later, on July 1st, 1796, James brought his son back to Dr. Jenner's office for the second part of the experiment. Junior sat on the exam table, looking like he wanted to sprint out the door, while Dr. Jenner took a jar of reddish powder out of one of his cupboards. It was a container of ground-up scabs from smallpox patients. James looked on uneasily as Dr. Jenner sprinkled some of the scabs into the straw and told Junior to hold the straw inside one of his nostrils. Then, once it was in place, Dr. Jenner blew the contaminated red dust into Junior's nose. Over the next several days, James kept a very close eye on his son. He was terrified that he would start developing a fever or the awful smallpox sores. One morning, 4 or 5 days after their visit to Dr. Jenner, Junior woke up with a scratchy throat, and James feared that his worst nightmare had come true. He imagined all these smallpox sores popping up inside of his son's throat, spreading across his face and down his arms and legs. He felt so stupid and guilty, he couldn't believe he'd put his child in this kind of danger. But then Junior drank some water, and suddenly his voice went back to normal. And with a smile on his face, he asked his dad, "When can I go play outside again?" James let out a long sigh of relief and said, "Soon, but not yet." Over the next week or so, Junior continued to just sail along without ever getting sick. And finally, James was satisfied that his son was perfectly fine, and he did let Junior back outside to play. Dr. Jenner's experiment had worked, and though James and his son had no way of knowing it, they had just helped revolutionize medicine forever. It turned out that Dr. Jenner's theory was correct. Cowpox and smallpox were so closely related that contracting one disease made people immune to the other. Dr. Jenner wrote a report about Junior's remarkable immunity to smallpox, and he named his new technique vaccination, after the Latin word for cow. And the name stuck because Dr. Jenner had invented the world's first vaccine. But as incredible as this discovery was, Dr. Jenner's report was met with mixed reactions. It took years for other doctors to endorse smallpox vaccination, and even longer for the public to embrace it. But Dr. Jenner believed in his new methods so much that he devoted the rest of his life to vaccinating patients and teaching other doctors how to do the same. Over the next century, Dr. Jenner's smallpox vaccine saved millions of lives every year. Then, in 1967, almost 2 centuries after James Phipps Jr. took part in Dr. Jenner's experiment, the World Health Organization began a campaign to permanently eliminate smallpox. And by 1980, they did it. A disease that caused countless deaths and immeasurable suffering was literally wiped off the face of the earth. And it all began with a sick milkmaid, a gardener's son, and a very creative doctor. From Mrballen Studios and Wondery, this is Miss Quiet Friday afternoon. A mother and her 5-year-old daughter sat across from each other playing a game of tic-tac-toe. The girl pushed her curly hair behind her ears and smiled at her mom. The little girl had been acting very strangely lately, and so her mom was grateful to see that it seemed like she was doing better. The mom picked up her pencil and drew a new tic-tac-toe board, and then placed an X right in the center to start the game. After that, her daughter excitedly scribbled an O to the right of the X. But when the mom made her next move, placing an X in the top right corner, she watched her daughter's face fall. The girl could see she was 1 X away from losing the game, and she began to whine. The mom tried to reassure the girl that it was just a game, but the girl continued to pout and kind of be upset as she placed an O in the bottom center square. The mom was about to write her winning X, but before she could mark the box, her little girl let out a high-pitched scream and begged her mom to stop. Then the usually sweet girl picked up a pencil and pointed the sharp tip at her mother's chest. And with a crazed look in her eyes, she shouted that she would stab her mom if she made another move. Wednesday morning in October of 2019, Tara Richardson gave her 5-year-old daughter Brielle a kiss on the forehead and then sent her out the front door of their house. Brielle's curly hair blew in the wind as she ran down the steps, and her oversized big girl backpack she'd insisted on buying bounced from shoulder to shoulder. Tara watched from the stoop as her daughter made her way to the bus stop in front of their house and then turned and waved goodbye to her mom with a big smile on her face. One of Tara's favorite things about her daughter was her enthusiasm for learning. Every morning, Brielle always jumped out of bed excited for the day ahead. Sometimes she was even up before Tara and her husband. They'd walk into the kitchen to find Brielle waiting, already dressed for school. Just a month ago, Brielle was even given a special award in her kindergarten class for upholding their school's motto, being responsible, respectful, and resourceful. However, last week, Brielle actually had to miss school while she recovered from a nasty cold, and it drove the little girl crazy. Tara thought about how glad she was that Brielle could go back to class now. Tara craned her neck and spotted the school bus a few blocks away. She gave Brielle one last wave and then walked inside and shut the door behind her. Her husband John had already dropped their other kids, Tommy and Sarah, off at preschool, which gave Tara just enough time to get herself ready for her busy day ahead. Tara was a psychiatrist in Wichita, Kansas, and had recently transitioned to working as a traveling therapist. Instead of working in one place, she spent her days traveling to different children's psychiatric hospitals and senior care facilities. Tara had just turned around to head upstairs to change when she heard somebody pounding on their front door. And so Tara rushed forward, worried something had happened to her daughter. She threw open the door and actually found Brielle standing there, crying and out of breath. Tara knelt in front of her daughter and asked what was going on, but Brielle could barely speak through sobs and full-body tremors. Tara quickly identified that her daughter, for whatever reason, was having a panic attack. And so, in a calm voice, she told Brielle to breathe in slowly for 3 counts and then out for 3 more. And as Brielle's breathing began to even out, Tara ushered her inside and then ran to the kitchen for a glass of water. When she returned, water in hand, Brielle was sitting on the carpet next to the front door. Tara peeked out the window and saw the school bus idling outside. She sat down next to Brielle and explained that the bus was going to have to leave without her. Brielle said she didn't care. She didn't want to leave the house, and she didn't want to go to school. Alarm bells went off in Tara's mind. Her daughter always wanted to go to school. Tara wondered if maybe something had happened recently. Maybe her daughter was being bullied. 15 minutes later, Brielle had finally calmed down enough to have a conversation with her mom. She would agree to go to school, but she let her mom know she was not happy about it. By the time Tara pulled up to Brielle's school, the first bell had already rung, and so Tara knew her daughter would be marked late. Tara watched her daughter grudgingly make her way to the front door of the school. The usual lightness in her step was gone. After Tara was certain that Brielle had gone inside the building, she pulled away from the curb and began the drive home, racking her brain for an explanation for Brielle's behavior. That evening, Tara set the table and called her family to the dining room for dinner. The day had been hectic, to say the least. After her crazy morning with Brielle, Tara was late to her first appointment of the day, and then to make up for the delay, she had to push all her other clients back. And so with all the chaos at work, Tara didn't get home until 6:30, which was why she only had time to make scrambled eggs and toast for dinner. Just as Tara was placing the serving dishes in the middle of the table, John appeared with the kids trailing right behind him. They took their usual seats, the littlest in his high chair and Sarah and Brielle on either side of their mother. Tara doled out eggs for everyone, while John buttered up some toast and passed it around. Tara knew Brielle was very likely still feeling sensitive after her panic attack that morning, but she was anxious to know how the rest of her daughter's day had gone. And so Tara asked Brielle, how was school? But Brielle didn't answer. Instead, she kind of slowly chewed her food like she didn't like it and just stared down at her plate. Tara repeated her question, but it was like Brielle didn't even hear her. Tara reached out to her daughter, trying to get her attention, but as she did, Brielle burst into tears. Tara watched as Brielle quickly became hysterical and started sobbing so hard she couldn't even chew her food. And then before long, she began choking on her eggs, gasping that she couldn't breathe. Tara and John jumped out of their seats and ran to Brielle, trying to get her to swallow the food. Finally, Brielle did calm down long enough to take some sips of water and get the eggs down. And when Tara asked her what happened, Brielle cried that she'd swallowed a piece of eggshell. She insisted that it was actually still in her mouth, or maybe stuck in her throat now. Tara was not so sure, but she led Brielle to the living room and had her lie down on the couch. And then Tara used her phone's flashlight to look inside of Brielle's mouth, all the way to the back of her throat, but she didn't see anything, no eggshells, nothing. And so she promised Brielle there was nothing to worry about, there was nothing stuck in her mouth or her throat. But her daughter said that was only because she had already swallowed the eggshell. And so she told her mom she was now scared this was going to kill her, this eggshell. But as much as Tara tried to convince her daughter that she really was okay, Brielle absolutely refused to eat any more of her dinner and spent the rest of the night absolutely obsessed with this eggshell. The next day, Tara woke up feeling refreshed. She hoped Brielle felt better too, and hopefully had forgotten about the eggshell incident, and so Tara brushed her teeth, then headed down the hall to Brielle's room to help her get ready for school. And she was surprised to see that Brielle was actually still lying in bed. Tara told her that, the bus is going to be here in 45 minutes, and Brielle still had to get dressed and eat breakfast. But as soon as Tara mentioned school, Brielle began to panic. She scrunched up her face and started crying that she couldn't go. She was not going to go. Tara tried to reason with her daughter. She explained, it's already Thursday, Brielle only had 2 more days before the weekend. And also, Tara reminded Brielle that she loved school. Tara even promised to put Rice Krispie treats in her lunch, Brielle's favorite snack. But mentioning food only seemed to make Brielle more upset. Through tears, she told her mom that she was now worried that she had accidentally swallowed a worm. Tara couldn't believe it, but she did her best to try to calm Brielle down and promised her there was no way she had swallowed a worm. But Brielle wouldn't hear it, and she just kept on crying. Eventually, Tara was able to finally convince Brielle that she was okay, but then the sound of the approaching bus outside set off a whole new wave of anxiety in the little girl. And Brielle dove under her covers, hiding her face, screaming she was not going to go to school. And so as this was happening, Tara decided, you know what, Brielle is in no shape to go anywhere today. In fact, she was starting to worry that there might be something seriously wrong with her daughter. And so she told Brielle that she could stay home this morning, and then she turned to get her cell phone from her bedroom. Tara dialed her office manager and explained she would need to cancel all her appointments for the day because she was dealing with a family emergency. Later that day, Tara sat in the living room with Brielle, brushing her long curly hair in slow, soothing motions. Once Tara had told her daughter that she could stay home, Brielle had actually mostly calmed down. It still had taken most of the morning for the little girl to start acting like herself again, but Tara was just happy that Brielle was not focused on, eating worms or eggshells anymore. But as Tara continued to brush her daughter's hair, Brielle began to fidget and shake her head from side to side. Tara asked her to sit still and tried brushing her hair again, but it was hopeless. The little girl kept craning her neck, trying to look at her hair, and then she just kept on shaking her head from side to side, trying to get her mom to stop brushing. Tara put the brush down and asked her, what's going on? And Brielle looked at her mom with terror in her eyes and said she was really worried that she just swallowed a whole bunch of hair while her mom was brushing it. Tara explained that maybe a little bit of hair had come loose, and it was definitely all in the hairbrush. Tara even showed Brielle the brush. But her daughter insisted there was more hair that Tara had not seen, and that was the hair she had swallowed. At this point, Tara knew the best thing she could do for Brielle was to actually show her that she was okay. So she grabbed her phone's flashlight and once again peered inside her daughter's mouth, and as she did, she told Brielle there was no hair, there was nothing in there. But her daughter just shook her head in disbelief. Brielle jumped up from the couch and ran to the bathroom, and when Tara caught up to her, she saw her daughter sitting on the bathroom counter looking in the mirror, her mouth wide open as she checked for loose hair. The following afternoon, Tara suggested that she and her daughter play a game of tic-tac-toe, one of Brielle's favorites. And Brielle immediately lit up at the suggestion, so Tara grabbed some paper and some pencils. The game started out fine, but as the game progressed, and it seemed like Tara was going to win, Brielle became increasingly agitated. In fact, she got really mad every time her mom made a move she didn't like. And then suddenly, Brielle actually threatened to stab her mom with a pencil. Tara was shocked. Her daughter had never, ever been violent before. Tara thought about how rapidly her daughter's behavior had deteriorated over the last 2 days. At this point, she couldn't even recognize this little girl sitting in front of her. And so it was becoming increasingly apparent to Tara that if Brielle did not get better soon, she would need professional help from someone other than her mother. The next evening on Saturday night, Tara was sitting at the kitchen table, and on the table was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that Tara had left out on purpose. Her daughter had refused to eat or drink anything all day, And so Tara had basically put the sandwich out in the hopes that Brielle would see it and finally get hungry enough to eat it. But Brielle just kept walking into the kitchen, looking at the sandwich, clearly seeming interested, but then backing out and walking away. And this had been going on since lunchtime. The girl just kept pacing back and forth between the living room and the kitchen, never stopping to actually eat. It broke Tara's heart to see her daughter acting this way, and so at some point she attempted to distract her daughter by asking her what her friends were doing this weekend, hoping that maybe Brielle would ask to meet up with one of her friends and have a play date. But Brielle did not take the bait and just kind of ignored her mom and just again kept on pacing back and forth between the kitchen and the living room, retracing the exact same steps each time. And also, as she was doing this, Brielle kept repeating the same phrase over and over again. "I'm hungry, but I don't want to die. I'm hungry, but I don't want to die," over and over again as she paced. And then eventually, by that afternoon, as the girl was still pacing, it was like she lost the ability to speak and could only get out fragments of words from this phrase. Tara watched in horror as her 5-year-old regressed to a 2-year-old speaking level. And then eventually, Brielle became so hungry and overwhelmed that she started to cry and then collapsed on the floor in a fit of anger and frustration. At this point, Tara, who was a trained psychiatrist, could see that very likely her daughter was showing classic symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD for short, which is where a person is plagued by recurring thoughts and can't stop themselves from doing the same thing over and over and over again. But Tara was thinking, this is happening way too rapidly. Tara knew that OCD developed gradually, and whatever was going on with Brielle had basically hit all at once. In just 2 days, Brielle had gone from healthy and happy to starving herself to the point of collapsing on the ground. Although Tara was a doctor herself, she knew she needed more help. A few minutes later, Tara paced around the kitchen, phone to her ear, as she explained what was going on with her daughter to the on-call pediatrician at the local hospital. And after asking Tara dozens of questions, this doctor suggested that Tara follow up with a neurologist. Tara was very familiar with the medical system, being a doctor herself, and knew it could take months for Brielle to get an appointment with a neurologist. Tara was totally exasperated, and she explained to this doctor that no, that would not work. Brielle wasn't eating or drinking anything. She needed help right now. 40 minutes later, Tara sat in an exam room at the Wichita ER, her hand clasping her daughter's. After what felt like forever, the emergency room physician strolled breezily into Brielle's room. She was younger than Tara expected, maybe in her early 30s, and she was wearing these brightly colored scrubs under her white coat. She introduced herself to Tara as Dr. Sarah Fields, and then she turned to Brielle. In a gentle voice, Dr. Fields asked Brielle what was going on. Tara watched as her daughter fidgeted in the bed and then said she was sick and that she had accidentally eaten a bunch of hair and was going to die. Dr. Fields just nodded and then began to conduct a routine examination of the child. After reviewing Brielle's symptoms and kind of taking some notes for a second, Dr. Fields looked at Tara and told her that she didn't think there was anything seriously wrong with Brielle. From what Dr. Fields could tell, she thought Brielle might have a urinary tract infection. Sometimes UTIs can be linked to behavioral changes like aggression, paranoia, and anxiety, all of which Brielle seemed to be experiencing. Dr. Fields had already called in a prescription for antibiotics. Beyond that, the doctor suggested that Brielle just drink some Gatorade to replenish her fluids. As Tara listened to this doctor, she felt frustration boiling up in her body. She knew Dr. Fields was likely doing her best, but her dismissive attitude was sort of outrageous. She knew that Brielle was struggling mentally, she was violent, had severe OCD, at least it seemed like she did, and she was refusing to eat or drink. All that would not be caused by a simple UTI. And so at that moment, Tara realized she would just have to figure this out herself. After they got home, Tara put Brielle to bed and then went down to the kitchen. She scrolled through her phone until she found her friend Deborah's phone number. The two had been colleagues in medical school, and after graduation, Deborah had gone into pediatrics. Tara composed a long text message explaining what was going on with Brielle and asked if Deborah knew any specialists who might be able to help. The next morning, Brielle and Tara were back at the hospital, but this time to be examined by a pediatric neurologist, Dr. Samuel Edwards, that Deborah had recommended. Miraculously, he was able to squeeze them in for an emergency appointment, and now Tara watched as her daughter paced around the room anxiously. After getting there, Dr. Edwards had decided to test Brielle to determine whether she was suffering from a potentially dangerous condition called encephalitis. Tara was grateful that Dr. Edwards was taking Brielle's symptoms so seriously, but she was terrified at the same time. Encephalitis causes inflammation in the brain and can cause symptoms such as confusion and hallucinations, but it can also be deadly. The sound of the exam room door creaking open pulled Tara out of her anxious thoughts. Dr. Edwards greeted Tara and knelt down next to Brielle. He removed his glasses and calmly asked Brielle if she wouldn't mind sitting down next to her mother. But it was like Brielle didn't hear him. She just stood there swaying back and forth. But Dr. Edwards was unfazed. He just said that was fine, Brielle could stay where she was. Dr. Edwards stood up and turned to Tara, and he explained that the MRI and the other tests they'd done on Brielle showed no signs of encephalitis or any other problem. He said he consulted with his medical team, and nobody was quite sure what to do next, but they did think Brielle was dealing with some sort of psychiatric condition. Dr. Edwards took a seat next to Tara and offered to admit Brielle to the Children's Psychiatric Hospital. Tara stared at the doctor, incredulous. She tried to control the anger she felt coursing through her body as she explained that she was the admitting psychiatrist on call for the Children's Psychiatric Hospital. She had witnessed the onset of Brielle's baffling symptoms herself, and in her experience, psychological issues do not present themselves this quickly and with such force, so this did not seem like a psychological issue. Dr. Edwards listened intently, nodding sympathetically. He looked over at Brielle, who was fidgeting and now sitting on the floor, and then back at Tara. And then the doctor said there was one more thing they could try. He knew of a neuropsychologist in Wichita who studied new and rare diseases. It was a long shot, but he might be able to figure out what was wrong with Brielle. Tara was very skeptical, but at this point, she was willing to try anything. And so after a moment, she thanked Dr. Edwards and asked him to please put her in contact with this physician right away. On Monday morning, Tara sat next to her daughter at the neuropsychologist's office. Brielle squirmed uncomfortably in her chair as the doctor asked Tara a series of questions about Brielle's recent health history. Tara's responses were admittedly curt and to the point. She didn't mean to be rude, but she didn't know how many more doctor's visits her daughter could take before she would have another episode. The last thing Tara wanted was for Brielle to lash out at this physician the way she had at Tara with the pencil. But the doctor, who clearly picked up on the mother's frustration, only had a few more questions. And one of those questions was, has Brielle suffered from a cold recently? Tara thought for a moment and said, yeah, Brielle had a bad cold a couple of weeks ago that had kept her home from school for a few days. At this point, the doctor stopped writing and looked up from his notepad. With an optimistic look on his face, he told Tara he was now almost certain he knew what was wrong with her daughter. The doctor, who again specialized in studying new and rare diseases, explained to Tara that when Brielle had gotten her cold, it almost certainly had triggered an incredibly rare immune response. Instead of trying to get rid of the virus, Brielle's body turned against itself, attacking her brain. This condition is called Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome, also known as PANS. Tara was shocked. She'd heard of PANS before, but it was so rare she'd never seen a case in real life. In fact, she was specifically trained to be very skeptical of it as a diagnosis. But in Brielle's case, after she thought about it for a minute, she knew it did have to be what they were dealing with. The onset of PANS is sudden and horrifying, and it only affects kids. While the symptoms vary from child to child, the disease is usually marked by anxiety and depression. Like Brielle, some children become violent, develop tics, and can even have hallucinations. Parents whose children have had PANS said their kids became completely different, seemingly overnight, just like what had happened to Brielle. But because PANS is so rare, it can sometimes take months or even years to correctly diagnose it. Tara was incredibly thankful that this doctor had been able to get the right answer in just 5 days. And she was especially grateful because the type of inflammation PANS causes is very hard to find on an MRI, like the one Brielle had gotten. And the disease is so rare, nobody else had thought to look for it. If it wasn't for this doctor's willingness to think outside the box, Tara may never have gotten the right diagnosis, and her daughter's life would have been at risk. Although Brielle was quickly diagnosed, she was not able to get the treatment she needed in Kansas. there was only one doctor in the state who treated PANS, and he couldn't see Brielle right away. Brielle's family ended up finding a specialist in Arizona who prescribed ibuprofen and steroids to treat the inflammation in her brain. And so even though Brielle's treatment began quickly, within a couple of weeks of showing symptoms, it still took 3 months to recover. In the wake of Brielle's battle with PANS, the Richardson family traveled to Topeka, Kansas to lobby the Kansas legislature to provide better care for children with PANS. Thanks to Tara and Brielle, Kansas did pass new PANS legislation in 2022 that provides medical coverage for children affected by this terrifying and rare disease. Sitting in the back seat of a pickup truck, a teenage boy watched in horror as the driver careened around the crushed vehicles and chunks of debris that littered the streets ahead of them. The sky was a deep, unnatural orange color, and the boy could hear sirens from police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks like something out of a disaster movie. But this was no movie. A deadly tornado was plowing through this city, leaving total destruction in its wake. The boy looked down at his lap, where he was cradling his unconscious friend's head. His friend's chest had been ripped so wide open that the bones of his rib cage were visible, and his face was so torn and bloody that he was almost unrecognizable. The boy hoped they would make it to the hospital in time to save his friend. But little did the boy know, once they got to the hospital, his friend's suffering was only just beginning. Around 5:15 p.m. on Sunday, May 22, 2011, 16-year-old Stephen Weersing was riding in the passenger seat of his friend Johnny's car as they barreled through the streets of Joplin, Missouri. It was a perfect spring day. They had the windows rolled down, and their friend Dylan, who was in the back seat, was singing along to the Blink-182 song that was blasting from the radio. And as they drove, Stephen stuck his right arm out the window to feel the wind, and as he did, he admired the tattoo that ran the length of his right forearm. The tattoo spelled Stephen's last name in a style that sort of looked like graffiti. He'd gotten it 2 weeks ago, and although he loved it, his parents did not, and they were still upset that he had actually gotten it. But Stephen didn't really care. Stephen turned around and asked Dylan to pass up the bag of potato chips they'd just bought at the store. Dylan took one more handful and then thrust the bag forward, and as Stephen grabbed the bag, big raindrops began hitting the windshield. Johnny quickly rolled up the windows, and when Stephen looked outside, he noticed the sky had gone from, slightly overcast to now very dark gray. Stephen instinctively turned down the volume on the radio and then said to his friends that it looked like a serious storm was coming. Johnny nodded and said he would start driving back to his house in South Joplin, where they could all wait out the storm together. But just 5 minutes later, as Johnny weaved through the back roads of the small city, the drizzling rain became a full-on downpour, and strong winds began to shake the car. Stephen leaned close to the windshield, trying to see through the heavy rain smashing into it to try to help his friend find the correct turn. But then something bounced off the window right in front of Stephen's face, startling him and causing everybody in the car to gasp. Stephen quickly realized that they were all kind of overreacting. It was just a stick that had hit the windshield, and for a second, Stephen wanted to laugh. But then all three boys heard off in the distance the ominous sound of a tornado siren, loud and clear even through the pounding rain. Growing up in a part of the country that's sometimes called Tornado Alley, Stephen and his friends had been through their fair share of tornadoes, and so they'd heard these sirens before. Normally, storms didn't really scare Stephen, but he could already tell that this tornado, was different. It had come on with almost no warning, and now more sticks and rocks were beating the sides of the car, and the gray sky had taken on a sickly orange tint. Johnny, who was white-knuckling the steering wheel at this point, turned to Stephen and Dylan and said, "Hey, we're almost at my house. I'm going to try to outrun the storm." And then Johnny hit the gas, turned right, and the rain actually suddenly stopped. For a moment, all Stephen and his friends could hear was just the urgent wail of the tornado siren. But then this overwhelmingly loud rumbling noise like a jet engine made Stephen suddenly cover his ears. And then pieces of cement and plywood began crashing into the car, this time shattering the passenger side window and filling the car with broken glass. Stephen turned to his friends, absolutely terrified, and he could see from all their looks that they were scared too. And then Stephen realized that the reason the rain had just stopped for a second is because Johnny had just unknowingly driven directly into the path of the tornado. But now there was basically nothing they could do. Johnny continued to try to drive, but the car began to shake harder and harder, and then Stephen felt the entire vehicle literally rise off the ground until none of the wheels were touching the road. Stephen and the others did their best to try to shield their bodies from all the debris flying through the broken window, but as the car began to spin faster and faster in midair, Stephen felt the wind pulling him out of the car. He screamed and his friends grabbed his legs, frantically trying to keep him inside. And then, as suddenly as the car had risen off the ground, it came smashing back down onto the street, landing on its roof and throwing the 3 teenagers out onto the street. But the tornado was not finished with them yet. Stephen's friends gripped the car to brace themselves against the strong winds, but Stephen had fallen further away from the vehicle, and he was again swept back up into the swirling vortex, this time with no car around him to protect him. Stephen watched as his friends grew smaller and smaller as Stephen was sucked farther up into the air. For just a moment, Stephen was acutely aware of the roaring wind and the debris pummeling him from all sides, and then everything went black. On the other side of town, Stephen's father, David, listened to the weather report on TV while he made sure all of his windows were shut and locked. The meteorologist said that a giant, mile-wide tornado was wreaking havoc on the southern part of Joplin, with winds blowing over 200 miles per hour. But even people who lived further north, like David, should still take cover. Just then, David's landline phone rang, and when he picked it up, he heard his ex-wife, Carissa, speaking, and she sounded very concerned. She asked David if he had heard from either of their sons. Ever since David and Carissa had gotten divorced, the couple shared custody of their kids, and both boys were staying at David's house that weekend. Carissa said she'd been trying to get in touch with the boys to warn them about the tornado, but she couldn't get in touch with them. Neither of them were answering their phones. David told Carissa that he had spoken to their younger son, Nathan, and he was safe, but he hadn't heard from Stephen all weekend, which was actually normal, because at the time, Stephen was going through a rebellious phase. Stephen and his dad had gotten into a big argument after Stephen decided to drop out of high school, and lately, Stephen would leave home for days at a time without telling anyone where he was, and he would do the exact same thing when he was staying at his mother's house. But David knew, despite all that, Stephen had a good heart, and he wouldn't just ignore his parents' phone calls when they just wanted to know that he was safe. So David told Carissa he would try to get in touch with Stephen. So David hung up and then used his cell phone to call and text Stephen. He didn't get a response, and as the rain and wind picked up outside and the tornado sirens continued to blare, David started to worry. He told himself that, Stephen was probably at one of his friends' houses, but Stephen had buddies all over the city. What if he'd been visiting someone in South Joplin, in the tornado's path? But there really wasn't anything David could do. With the storm outside, David basically just had to stay home and wait it out before he went out looking for his son. 30 minutes later, David was glued to the news, and the meteorologist finally reported that the tornado in South Joplin had passed and it was now safe for people to go outside. David still had not been able to contact Stephen, so as soon as he heard the all clear, he grabbed his keys and ran out to his car. David planned to drive to the 2 hospitals in Joplin to check if Stephen was at either one. And as he drove, David felt a bit of relief seeing that his neighborhood was still in good shape. There was debris here and there, and a few thin trees had snapped in half, but nobody's houses or cars were severely damaged. However, David's relief turned to anxiety as he drove further south, where the tornado had actually touched down, and he saw the widespread devastation. To David, it looked like a giant had stomped right on top of the town. Houses were flattened into piles of wood and brick, power lines had collapsed, battered cars and trucks were littered all over the streets, creating roadblocks that were nearly impossible to pass. David turned on the car radio to see what the local news station was saying about the storm, and a reporter came on and said the tornado had been categorized as an EF5, which is the highest on the scale. Thousands of buildings had been damaged or destroyed, hundreds of residents were injured, and dozens of people had already been found dead. David fought hard to keep his anxiety at bay, praying that Stephen had not been in this area when the tornado had come through. Finally, David reached St. John's Regional Medical Center, and he was horrified to see that the huge multi-story building had been decimated too. An entire side of the hospital was now gone, and David could see first responders running in and out of the building, hustling survivors out. And so David just turned and began driving toward Joplin's other hospital, called Freeman Health System. As he pulled into the parking lot, David was relieved to see that Freeman was still standing. And so he parked his car in the lot and then ran inside. Entering Freeman Hospital was like walking into a nightmare. The emergency room was crowded with people who'd been injured, some quite badly. David saw one man who had a bloody, obviously broken leg, and there was a woman with shards of glass literally sticking out of her arms and chest. He could hear children crying and the muted sounds of an ambulance pulling up outside. And at least a dozen people were lined up in front of the reception desk, all new patients waiting to be checked in. David didn't want to waste valuable time waiting in that line, so he just started walking around the lobby asking random hospital employees if they'd seen a skinny 16-year-old boy with dark shaggy hair. But everyone he talked to said no. But just then, a doctor came out of the doors that led to the emergency room, and her blue scrubs were stained with blood, and she looked completely overwhelmed. But David just sprinted right up to her and asked her the same question. Hey, have you seen my son? You know, he's 16, he's got scraggly hair, he's skinny, and he also has a big tattoo on his right forearm. When the doctor heard this, in particular the right forearm tattoo comment, the doctor's expression changed, and she told David to please follow her. And she led him through the chaotic hallway and into a room where a teenage boy was lying unconscious on a bed with a breathing tube inserted directly into the front of his neck. His face was so badly injured that David didn't actually recognize him. But then the doctor walked over to the boy and gently lifted up the boy's right arm and showed David the tattoo. And when David saw it, he knew immediately he'd found his son. The doctor said a good Samaritan had brought Stephen and one of his friends to the hospital, and Stephen apparently had been riding around with two other teenage boys when their car had been sucked up into the tornado. The other two teenagers were okay, but Stephen was not. He was in terrible shape. He had a serious head injury, several cracked ribs, a punctured lung, and a deep, open wound on his abdomen that left the right side of his rib cage totally exposed. But despite all his injuries, the doctor said that hospital staff had been able to stabilize him. And so right now, the doctor said he was doing basically as well as he could be, and they hoped he would just continue to improve. David was shocked and horrified and heartbroken to hear what his son had gone through, but the doctor at least sounded somewhat optimistic, which made David hopeful too. And so David thanked the doctor and then called Stephen's mother, Carissa, to tell her the bad news. 5 days later, Carissa sat beside her son's hospital bed, wishing that Stephen could talk to her. The doctors were keeping him in a medically induced coma so that his brain could heal from his traumatic head injury. But Carissa spoke to him anyway, telling him that she loved him and that he was strong. And she wanted to believe that her son could hear her because he did seem to be doing better. Some of Stephen's bruises were lightening up, and the smaller scrapes and cuts he had were starting to heal as well. But one side of his face was still covered in a thick scab, and Carissa had not yet dared to look beneath the huge white bandage that stretched from her son's belly button up to his right armpit. Carissa reached out to hold Stephen's hand, and she noticed that his fingers looked bigger than usual, like they were swollen. Carissa got up and walked to the other side of his bed, and she saw that his other hand looked swollen too. A few minutes later, when a nurse came in to check on Stephen, Carissa asked about Stephen's hands. The nurse looked closely and said the swelling in his hands might be caused by an infection inside of his body. The nurse did not seem that concerned, but she told Carissa she would ask the doctor to get Stephen started on a course of antibiotics right away, which should help his body fight off this infection. Carissa nodded and gave the nurse a weak smile like she was okay with this answer, but inside, she had no idea what kind of infection caused a person's hands to swell up so much. But the nurse did not seem like she had any time for questions. She was already rushing out of the room. Carissa knew the doctors and nurses were doing their best, but they were clearly overworked, and it worried her that they hadn't noticed these signs of Stephen's potential infection. But Carissa just felt glad that she was at least there to look after her son and make sure his medical team didn't miss anything. And so she and David agreed to coordinate their schedules so that at least one of them was always by Stephen's side.
In
Stephen's antibiotic treatment began, Carissa and David were sitting beside each other on the small couch in Stephen's room when a doctor walked in. He had a grave expression on his face as he told the parents that the antibiotics did not seem to be working. In fact, the swelling in Stephen's hands had only gotten worse. And now he was also running a fever, and his blood pressure kept jumping and then plummeting. The doctor said that with every passing hour, Stephen's condition was getting less and less stable. And the doctor admitted that the hospital didn't have the resources to take care of Stephen at the moment. They were struggling just to find beds for all the patients who'd been injured during the tornado. The doctor said that what Stephen really needed was a team of doctors who had the time and space to care for him properly. So they suggested having Stephen airlifted 150 miles north to Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. The doctor promised Stephen would get better, more specialized care there than he could in Joplin. For the parents, this was not even a question. Of course they would take Stephen wherever he needed to go to get better. So just a few minutes later, Carissa watched as medical staff loaded her still unconscious son into a medical helicopter, and then David jumped in after him and gave Carissa a hesitant wave goodbye. Carissa backed away and watched as the helicopter took off and began its journey, and then Carissa headed out to the parking lot, got into her car, and began the long drive north to Kansas City. That same afternoon, at the Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, a pediatric infectious disease specialist named Dr. Mary Ann Jackson stepped into the room where her newest patient had just arrived. Dr. Jackson, who was a very energetic woman, had decades of experience treating children with unidentified infections, which made her the perfect person to take care of Stephen. She'd already been briefed on his condition, so when she went into his room, she was not surprised to see him laying there unconscious with a breathing tube down his throat. Dr. Jackson introduced herself to Stephen's father, who was in the room, and she explained that she was here to figure out what was causing his son's hands to swell up. And then Dr. Jackson walked over to Stephen and looked at his hands, which were definitely still very swollen, but she couldn't see any open wounds on his hands or wrists where an infection could develop. And so Dr. Jackson began to check out the rest of Stephen's injuries. The scabs on his face were healing well, and so too were the cuts and bruises on his arms and legs. That just left Stephen's biggest wound, the one on his abdomen, which was currently covered by a huge white bandage. Dr. Jackson carefully removed that bandage, and even though the doctors from Freeman Health System had warned her about the severity of Stephen's injury, she still was not prepared for what she saw. His entire side was exposed. The skin, fat, and muscle that would normally protect his ribcage had all been ripped away. And then Dr. Jackson noticed that sort of surrounding this horrible wound on his abdomen was this weird, shiny black material that almost looked like patent leather. Dr. Jackson recognized this as dead tissue. Whatever infection Stephen had, it was causing the skin and muscle around the wound to die and turn black. Dr. Jackson knew that this was obviously a very dangerous situation. Dead tissue can be a breeding ground for all kinds of dangerous bacteria, plus it stops wounds from healing properly. Dr. Jackson explained to Stephen's father they would need to bring his son in for surgery immediately. All of that dead black tissue around Stephen's wound would need to be surgically removed as soon as possible. David looked uneasy, but he said, okay, whatever you have to do. And then he squeezed his son's hand and told him that he was strong and he was going to be okay. And then a nurse came in and wheeled Stephen away to be prepped for surgery. That evening, in the operating room, Dr. Jackson watched as a surgeon carefully removed sections of the thick black tissue from around Stephen's chest wound. The surgeon cut away as much dead tissue as he could find, but what was left behind didn't look very healthy either. Dr. Jackson could already tell that Stephen was almost certainly going to need another operation after this one. And so after the surgeon was done and began putting a fresh bandage over Stephen's chest, Dr. Jackson took samples of the dead tissue they'd removed and sent them to the hospital lab for analysis. 2 days later, Dr. Jackson was back in the operating room, standing next to the surgeon as he held a scalpel close to Stephen's chest. They had not received the results of tissue analysis from the lab yet, but when Dr. Jackson checked in on Stephen that morning, she realized she had been right. He definitely needed more surgery. Because not only was there more dying and blackened tissue surrounding Stephen's wound, but something even more disturbing was happening. Something that Dr. Jackson had never seen in over 25 years of practicing medicine. Looking down at Stephen's exposed ribs, Dr. Jackson and the surgeon both saw fuzzy black material growing on top of Stephen's bones and into his muscles. Dr. Jackson turned to the surgeon and said it sort of looked like mold. And so whatever infection Stephen had, it was clearly eating away at his flesh and also spreading throughout his chest cavity. And even though Stephen was on huge doses of antibiotics, this infection kept on growing at an alarming rate. Dr. Jackson watched as the surgeon carved away as much of the mold and dead tissue as he could. But still, Dr. Jackson knew this was not sustainable. With each surgery, they were chopping off more and more of Stephen's skin and muscle. And so they couldn't just keep doing that because that would eventually kill him. Plus, this infection appeared to just grow back anyway. But regardless, when the surgeon was finished and Stephen went back to the recovery room, Dr. Jackson briefed his parents about what she and the surgeon had found. She still didn't know what this infection was, but it was clearly very aggressive and was not responding to any of the medications the doctors had tried so far. Dr. Jackson swore she was going to do everything she possibly could to help their son, but she admitted it was going to take a miracle for their son to pull through this. David looked at the doctor with tears in his eyes. He said he didn't understand how this was happening. One moment, Stephen was a perfectly healthy kid. The next, he was injured in this freak tornado accident. And now his body was being ravaged by some kind of mysterious flesh-eating infection, and nobody could tell them what it was, how he got it, or how to help him. It just didn't make any sense. 10 days later, Dr. Jackson arrived for her shift at the hospital. She pulled on her white coat and walked down the hallway towards Stephen's room to check on him. But she was not feeling optimistic. Ever since Stephen's second surgery, his condition had just kept on getting worse. The tissue surrounding his wound was slowly dying, and as hard as the hospital staff had tried to keep his wounds clean, that fuzzy black mold just kept coming back. But just before she got to Stephen's room, a lab technician stopped her in the hallway and told her they'd finally gotten the results of Stephen's tissue analysis. This lab report did explain what was causing Stephen's life-threatening infection. And while Dr. Jackson was glad to finally have some answers, she knew that this diagnosis was not good news. The rare infection that was ravaging Stephen's body had less than a 20% survival rate, and the only treatment was absolutely brutal. Surgeons would need to cut every last bit of the infection out of his body. And so just a few hours later, Dr. Jackson was once again in the operating room with the same surgeon who had performed Stephen's first two surgeries. And as the surgeon sliced away mold and dead tissue, he suddenly turned to Dr. Jackson with a horrified expression on his face. Now, the mold was not just on Stephen's bones and in his muscles. Mold had also made its way into Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. In order to get this infection out of Stephen's body, the surgeon was going to have to remove parts of Stephen's vital organs. Dr. Jackson told the surgeon that they just didn't have any other choice. Stephen might die if he lost parts of these organs, but he would definitely die if the surgeon left any trace of the infection behind. So, the surgeon very carefully began to cut away moldy sections of Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. And when the surgery was over, Stephen had lost so much bodily tissue that Dr. Jackson could literally see his internal organs through the gaps in his ribs. She could see his lungs inflate and could see what was left of his heart still beating. And so even though Dr. Jackson wanted to remain optimistic, looking down at the mangled boy, she just couldn't imagine how he was going to survive this. 8 weeks later, in August of 2011, Stephen's mom, Carissa, was curled up on the fold-out bed in Stephen's hospital room, trying her best to relax. She had stayed there almost every night that summer, but she rarely got any sleep. Even after the doctors had removed parts of Stephen's vital organs, the infection kept coming back. And so Stephen had undergone 12 more surgeries to remove mold and dead tissue from inside of his chest, and then a few days after Stephen's most recent surgery, Dr. Jackson had roused Carissa to tell her that for the first time, the mold had not come back. They had finally cured Stephen's infection. At first, Carissa wanted to celebrate, but then reality came crashing down on her. As doctors worked hard to save Stephen's life, his body had been damaged almost beyond repair. Despite this infection being gone, he might never wake up from his coma. And even if he did, at a minimum, he was going to need multiple reconstructive surgeries and years of physical therapy. And so that evening, thoughts about her son's uncertain future kept Carissa wide awake as usual. And so, needing a distraction, Carissa sat up, grabbed the TV remote, and flipped through the channels until she found MTV, Stephen's favorite channel. And then she sat upright on the hard fold-out bed and reached over to hold her son's hand. Out of the corner of her eye, she could have sworn she saw Stephen move. Carissa turned her head and looked at Stephen, and she saw that she was not mistaken. Stephen was blinking. His eyes were now wide open. For the first time since the tornado nearly 3 months ago, her son was awake. Stephen looked around the room, confused about where he was and what was happening, and then a moment later, he looked right at his mom. And she burst out laughing and crying at the same time, totally overcome with joy. The following morning, Dr. Jackson stood next to Stephen's hospital bed. Stephen's parents were both in the room, and they both looked happier and more energized than they had in months. Although Dr. Jackson had been treating Stephen since June, this was the first time she was really meeting him, and the shaggy-haired teenager had a lot of questions for her. He said that the last thing that he could remember was tumbling out of his friend's car and being pulled up into the tornado. He had no idea what happened after that. Dr. Jackson told him that the fact that he was alive was a miracle. She explained how terribly injured he'd been after the tornado, but that wasn't even the worst of it. After being hurt, he'd developed this infection that ate away at his skin, muscles, and organs, and very nearly killed him. This incredibly rare infection was called zygomycosis, and it was caused by a fungus that had invaded Stephen's body. The fungus blocked off his blood vessels, causing his skin and muscle tissue to die and rot. At the same time, it grew rapidly inside of his body, appearing as black mold on his ribs and in his muscles and organs. This fungus usually lives in water or underground, and it doesn't normally make people sick. However, during the devastating tornado, which killed over 150 people and injured thousands of others, this fungus had been swept up into the vortex. And after Stephen's chest was cut wide open, that fungus that was in the tornado was literally blown into his chest cavity, where it took hold and began multiplying quickly. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention determined that 12 other people who were affected by this tornado had also developed the same horrible infection as Stephen because they had open wounds and the fungus was blown inside of them. But Dr. Jackson actually told Stephen that compared to some of the other victims, he was one of the lucky ones. 5 of those 12 other people affected by this fungus had died. Stephen had to spend another 3 months in the hospital before he was healthy enough to go home. Even then, he underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries and was left with a giant scar stretching from his belly button almost to his neck. But much like the tattoo he got when he was 16, Stephen feels like his huge tornado scar is an important part of his story because it shows how far he's come. After his battle with deadly fungal infection, Stephen decided to go back to school and finish his education. And today, he's a proud father to 4 young kids, and he couldn't be happier. Although, from time to time, he still has nightmares about the tornado that changed his life.